Hey, welcome back to week number 4 of our Arise journey. Man, I'm so excited. I'm excited about the different ways God has challenged me through this whole process. And for me, it started a little bit earlier than the rest of the church, maybe for you guys, because it backs up, at least a couple of years. But as God has just led us to this point, He led the elders and I, and the staff and I to this point, and now the whole church is involved in this process, and we are all saying, hey, we want to arise into what God has called us to do and take our next step. And man, what an incredible journey that we're on. And I can't wait, again, I just can't wait to see what God does through us. And now here we are in week number 4, still kind of studying the life of Abraham. And this week, what we're talking about is this word that is easy to say and challenging to do. Challenging to live. It's this word of surrender. That if we're going to arise and really step into what God's called us to do, we have to live a life of surrender. Genesis 22 tells, I think, and I know we've all heard it, and if you grew up in church, you've heard it a million times, and I know by the time I was 6 years old, this was just a story in the Bible that we all knew. And sometimes, being familiar with something like that can kind of take away, or detract from its power. But it tells the story of Abraham, and God tells Abraham, hey, I want you to take this promised son who you waited 25 years to see, right? And I want you to take him up on that mountain, and I want you to burn him. Now, I know we know the Bible story, but can we just stop and say, that's freaky. Like, this is not something that you just get up and say, oh, okay, no big deal, this is a son. You were barren. 25 years ago, God says, I'm going to give you a family. He's been through Ishmael. They've gone through the moving. They've done all this stuff. And now he has Isaac. In fact, Isaac, most theologians say, is probably a teenager. Could have been 17, 18. Some people say as old as 20, 22 years old. So this is, you're talking about, he's grown. And now he's like, I want you to take this son and I want you to go offer him as a sacrifice. It's an incredible story, to say the least. It's incredible when you think about it. And the fact that Abraham goes. It says he got up. He arose. I love it. The Bible says we're talking about arise, but it says, and Abraham arose the next morning. I don't think he told Sarah, because that wouldn't be wise. No, But he arose, and so he surrenders. I think surrender is what moves us towards our calling. In fact, I would say that faith looks like surrender, and I don't know so much that we grow in faith as much as we grow in surrender. I think more than we grow in faith, I think what it really calls us to is to grow in surrender. Let's talk about a few things around this idea of surrendering to God. Number one is, I think surrender always challenges our hearts. Surrender always challenges our heart. When you look at the life of Abraham, can I tell you something? That surrendering sin isn't really the challenge. That when God usually is talking to us about surrender, He's talking about surrendering the blessings. I think it's harder to surrender the blessings of God, the blessings back to God, than it is just to surrender our sin and our failings. And I think that's what you see. I think the greatest threat to your relationship with God is what He blesses you with. Right? Because you can get your eye on the blessing and not the blesser. I don't know. Here's been my theory for years. Abraham and God seem to have these dialogues throughout Genesis. Genesis 12, and Genesis 15, Genesis 17, and now we're at Genesis 22. But interestingly enough, they have this dialogue, and then the next thing you know, Isaac is born. And then you don't have any dialogue until Genesis 22. And Isaac is now 17, 18, 19, 20 years old. 20 years, Abraham and God don't seem to have a talk. And I think God looks down, and the real question God's trying to determine is, what can I bless you with and it not take you away from me? Like, what can I give you? How much can I give you and it doesn't become a threat to our relationship? And sometimes I think that this whole text that we find in Genesis 22 is about God making sure that he was still first and that Isaac hadn't become an idol to Abraham. Because what God blesses us with, sometimes it actually can become an idol. I think sometimes, when we talk about biblical finance and we talk about giving and we talk about stewardship, the Bible talks about this 10%, give the first 10%, this tithe, right? And let's all be honest, that's not easy to do. I mean, if you grew up like me in church and you grew up thinking God was a mafia boss and if you didn't pay him off with 10%, he was going to take care of everything away from you, that might be a little bit easier, but it's not faith motivated, it's fear motivated. And we have to come to a place of being motivated by faith to surrender. But, why 10%? Well, 10 is the number of testing. And what I realize every time I get paid, I take a test on whether I'm going to let what God has blessed me with take his place or not. And so every time I get paid, I've got this test to take where I'm going to say, hey, am I going to make sure that he's still number one? Am I going to make sure that nothing is taking the place? He has prospered me and he has blessed me and he has increased me. And I want to make sure that he and I are both on the same page, that this blessing will not take the place of the blesser. And I think this idea of surrender is challenging to us. And I think, the truth is God uses, I think, sometimes our finances, I think he uses it just to test our hearts and to make sure that he's still first. Paul writes to the Philippians in Philippians 4:17, it's this interesting verse, says, not that I seek the gift. In other words, the Philippians had given an offering to Paul. And he said, I'm not seeking the gift, but I seek the fruit that increases to your credit. In other words, it's what Paul said. I'm so glad you gave, but it's really not about you giving into my need. It's about what God has done through your giving in your own life. And I think this is what we see with Abraham, that here's this test, and Abraham passes the test. And what we're going to see is God reveal himself in such a new way. I think surrender challenges us, but I think surrender, the fruit of surrender is always obedience. Surrender is seen in our obedience. Let's be honest. Surrender looks like obedience when you really think about it. And I want to say this, obedience, sometimes in church we make things about a formula, when really obedience is relational. It's interesting to me because I, as a pastor, you hear all these cool stories, and I can have one family say, God told us we had to give all of our TVs away, and this is the season we will not watch TV. And at the same time, I'm hearing another family say, man, we won a contest and won like 5 free TVs. And while God is asking one family to do this way, he's blessing another family with the thing he asked them to get rid of. Because obedience with God is relational. It's not a formula. It's not about fitting in a box. It's about surrender. It's about following God. And most of the time, he's asking us to surrender because he's looking for the idols in our heart. And so a lot of times what determines what God is asking us to surrender is where he's seeing the work needs to be done in our own hearts. And so we see this surrender through obedience. And I think the first key of obedience is being willing to hear God. I think that's obvious. I've got to be willing to hear God. But the second thing is being willing to do what he said when he said to do it. I like Abraham's response that we see in Genesis 22. It says, he said to God, God said to Abraham, take now your son. Like, don't pray about it for a month. How many times have we spent a month praying about something we knew God wanted us to do? Right? I mean, like, the way I read the Bible, you should give the first 10% of your income. Jesus said we should. It's in the New Testament. It's in the Old Testament. And there's still a lot of people praying, like, God, should I tithe? He's like, you need me to answer that again for you. I mean, it's like, but so many times, the truth is, we know what God wants us to do. What we're hung up on is whether or not we'll surrender. Right? Surrender is where we're stuck, not with the command. We're stuck with the obedience. Right? And I think that's what I see about Abraham, because I think delayed obedience is disobedience. And I think partial obedience is disobedience. I think maintaining this relationship or having this relationship with God requires complete obedience in the moment that God asks us to be obedient with the thing he asks us to obey him in, because usually if God is speaking to us in that way, we are having to surrender. We have to surrender to walk in obedience. And the surrender is actually aimed at a possible idol that God sees us escalating in our hearts. And so God is like, hey, this could be a problem. I'm going to ask you to give that up. And then the battle starts of like, am I going to do it? Am I going to do it now? Am I going to do it later? Am I going to pray about it? What am I going to do? Right? This is where I want us to pause for just a moment. And I want to have some discussion. So if you're watching online, you're going to pause right here. If you're in a group, this is where you pause. And here are a couple of questions, a couple of things I want you to discuss. Number one, what does it mean for you to completely surrender to God? What does it mean to completely surrender? And number two, why does God ask us to surrender? So I want you to have some discussion around those two ideas. And so you can pause here and we'll be back just in a moment to finish up week number 4. See you in just a minute. Well, hey, welcome back. Hopefully you guys had some great discussion around this idea of surrender. And we were talking about how surrender really challenges our heart and how surrender is really our surrender seen through our obedience. That are we really going to resolve and sometimes resign ourselves to what God is telling us to do? Here's what I think is powerful about surrender. Those are kind of the challenges. That's the decision point. This is kind of on the other side of it. The other side of it is that surrender always releases the power of God. This is why it's so key, because we've got this challenge, like God's challenging our heart. Sometimes He's challenging our idols. And then we've got kind of this precipice that we come to, this point that says, are we going to obey? And are we going to obey now? And are we going to exactly obey? Right? And then, but on the other side of that, that's why then, after that, then we get to see the power. Because here's the story. Abraham is walking, and I love this. Oh man, I love this. Because God tells him to use this mountain called Mount Moriah. Now, I have a daughter named Moriah, so I know what that means. Because the word actually means God is my teacher. And so God actually says, Abraham, I'm going to ask you to surrender on a mountain where you're going to get an education. Right? Like this whole thing is a setup. Like Abraham doesn't really even see it. It's a setup. In other words, God's like, I'm about to take you to school. I'm going to teach you something. And so I want you to go to the classroom of a mountain with your son. You're going to obey me. You're going to walk up this mountain. And now you're going to take Isaac, who is the promise. And you're going to, and Abraham, we know the story. He pulls a knife back. It was a mercy killing. God had said offering a burnt sacrifice. But Abraham's like, I'm going to slay the sacrifice. And then I'm going to offer the sacrifice. And Abraham pulls the knife back, and the angel of the Lord stops him, right? He stops him. And then he says, now I know, right? Here's this question. Now I know he's not an idol, right? Now I know because you were willing to put him on an altar. See, anything you won't put on an altar is an idol. Like there's the test. If you won't put it on the altar, right? If you won't put your finances on the altar, your house on the altar, your car on the altar, your life on your altar, whatever you're not willing to put, your kids, whatever you're not willing to put on an altar is an idol. And so God gives him the altar test, which is the idol test, and he says, now I know because you haven't withheld your son. Now I know he's not an idol. He is not in competition with me. Right? Because God said, you can't have any other gods but me. So he's going to challenge anything that's trying to take his place. And he says, hey, now I know, like now I know he's safe. Now I know we're good. Now I know. And so Abraham looks up, and in the thicket is a ram. It's a sacrifice. And God reveals himself as Jehovah Jireh. Right? It's this, God had always been a provider. But in this moment, God says, hey, I'm going to reveal me as pull back, open the curtain. I'm going to open the curtain. I'm going to let you see something that has been about me since the beginning that you've never walked in the revelation of, and that is that I'm a provider. Right? See, everybody, listen, can I just be honest? Everybody, all of us want to know that God's a provider. But some of us can't put things on the altar. And you're never going to know he's a provider until you're obedient to put your idol on the altar or whatever he's calling you to, right? And so Abraham, like, okay, I'll be obedient. I'm going to put Isaac on the altar. And man, I can't even imagine. Like, I have 3 kids. I'm just telling you, I'd have been out on this one. I'm just being honest as I can be. I would love to think that if God said, I want you to offer one of your children on the altar, that I'd be like, yeah, God, I can totally do that. I'm just telling you, I don't think I could. I think I'd be out on this deal. But Abraham did, and God said, now I can see. Now I can see You're not even withholding the promise from me. Because the threat to our relationship with God is what God blesses us with. It's kind of an interesting thing because God is never, when He calls us to surrender, He's never trying to take from us. He's always trying to give to us. That's why He has to test the heart. He wasn't trying to take Isaac from Abraham. He was actually trying to give Abraham a greater blessing. God's not into subtraction. God is into multiplication. In fact, you see this. God actually says, now in multiplying, I will multiply you. Like Abraham, you let me challenge you with surrender. You decided to walk in complete obedience in the right time, in the right thing, in the right moment. And now here is the power of that moment. I'm revealing who I am to you, and now in multiplying, I will multiply you. And then he says this is so cool. He says, and your descendants will possess the gates of their enemies. In other words, Abraham, your family will always win. Like God had never said that to Abraham before. This was something completely new. Like in multiplying, hey, you haven't withheld, I will multiply. I wasn't trying to take, I was trying to give. And now here's what you need to understand. Here's the power of surrender. Here's the power of surrender, is that I will make you a victor and I will make you more powerful than any enemy you ever face. It's the power of surrender. Abraham doesn't find that out. Abraham doesn't find that out if he doesn't go to that mountaintop. If he doesn't take Isaac to that mountaintop, he doesn't even find that out. You see, I think to me, this is the thing hell fears the most. I don't think hell fears church, because church is a group of people. And that could be movement or it can not be movement. They could be stuck in religion and not doing a whole lot. They could be really worried about the bake sale and the potluck. Hell fears surrender. What did Jesus pray right before He went to the cross? If it's possible, let this cup pass. But if it's not my will, but your will. What shook hell and won the victory for every believer? What causes us to be able to possess the gates of our enemy? The gates of hell will not prevail. Why? Because it's surrender. Surrender. It's challenging. We see it through our obedience, but after that, surrender is what releases the power of God, the inheritance of God to us. See, I think that's this moment that we're all in as a church. In fact, this is week 4. In week 5, we're going to be making commitments to what God's calling each of our families to do to create the movement that we want to see. And this is that place of surrender. This is that moment to say, hey, are we going to put it on the altar or not? And what's God calling us to put on the altar? And how's God calling us to respond? This is that moment. And this is the moment that hell fights. And this is the moment that we war, because hell is not really worried about a believer, but it sure is worried about a surrendered believer. And this is the moment that God is calling us through surrender to arise. God says, Abraham, I want you to slay Isaac. And the Bible records, and he arose. And this is the moment God says, hey, I want you to surrender, and we arise. Before we go, a couple of things that I want you to discuss there in your groups at home. Number 1, what are the fruits of surrender that we see in our life? In other words, what does it produce when we surrender? And number 2, what did surrendering Isaac do for Abraham? What did surrendering Isaac do for Abraham? I want you to discuss that in your groups. And then I want you to make sure you're here this week number 5, commitment weekend at Pathway, and then follow up at Lifegroup as we conclude week number 5. Listen, God's moving. Hopefully He's moving in your life. I know He's moving in mine. I know He's moving in ours. And we can't wait to see what God does through all of us as we surrender and arise. We'll see you next weekend. Or next week. Hopefully next weekend and next week. We'll see you then. The best is yet to come because we will surrender.